Hey, back again to talk to you a little bit about the first few chapters of the Watchmen to establish some of the elements. And today I am going to talk about plot. The previous one in the series, part one, was about characters and the introduction of characters. First thing is that Watchmen starts off with a dead body. This is a classic mystery of the British and American tradition, particularly the American. Mysteries as plot dynamics work because they impose information like a dead body or a clue, and they subtract who is the killer, or for example, who took the Maltese Falcon, something like that. This is a great motivator for a plot because it immediately involves the viewer. In many cases, the viewer or the reader becomes has pathos with the detective because they start getting involved in trying to solve the mystery themselves. Raymond Chandler, whose first big novel was The Big Sleep, was one of the great hard-boiled detective writers coming out of the 40s and 50s, which is considered the golden age of the genre. And his argument was that detective stories needed to be rational and realistic, so that in order to be an enjoyable experience to the reader. In other words, the mysteries had to be solvable, but had to be clever enough that the reader did not finish it until it was revealed. And then there would be an aha moment of, oh my goodness, I should have understood that. All of the clues were laid out for me, and the hard-boiled detective cleverly put them together, but I was one step behind him. And then suddenly it makes sense. Interestingly, the famous detective Sherlock Holmes, written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, did not follow those steps. A lot of times, Sherlock Holmes would figure out things with clues that would only be revealed in the last page, such, for example, a particular type of clay that was on somebody's shoes that had not been to the reader beforehand. The idea behind this is that this is a very sensitive use of suspension of disbelief that gives the detective story a verisimilitude. In other words, it's a sense that it could have actually happened in terms of the evidence and the relationship to solving the crime. These hard-boiled detective novels became a huge genre in American fiction called film noir, using the kind of cinematography from German Expressionism. These were classified by voiceovers, black and white, beautiful women called femme fatales coming into a detective who was good with his hands and fists, but always smarter than everybody else. And they had kind of a sexy, kind of hardcore feel to them. And they were kind of a phenomenon in this. In many ways, the beginning of The Watchmen has this film noir take, although Rorschach is kind of a questionable detective. So let's talk a little bit about some of the plot dynamics. Um, the plot dynamics and a typical narrative start off by creating a setting and then creating plot tension. The setting: once upon a time there was a beautiful whatever, and then but one day there is a conflict that's introduced. In other words, the status quo of the setting is disrupted. Interesting, mysteries have a slightly different dynamic. Mysteries start with a clue or a body. The detective comes on the scene and the investigation begins. And tension builds as the clues start to mount and connect. Then there is usually obstacles to finding the clues, like a chase or an interrogation or something like that. So in The Watchmen, it's an interesting case because it starts off with uh, Rorschach going between the various other members who previously had been of The Watchmen, and he's doing that because he says that he's worried and that he thinks that somebody might be killing superheroes or killing costumes. But it also seems that Rorschach is also playing the role of that police detective of the hardboiled detective films and also film noir. He seems to be interrogating everybody and asking them about their relationships, such as when he asked Night Owl about his relationship to the old Night Owl, and he seems to be poking around for almost evidence that sometimes people in his former team might be involved. From the level of Alan Moore, this serves as a plot device because it pulls together the characters, context, and relationships. So we start to get curiosity, and later flashbacks and relationships between the characters can be revealed. And at the end, oddly enough, there's a little bit of romance in the term of a menage a trois, not the dirty kind of sex menage a trois, but the classic love story that goes back to, for example, to Arthurian legend. So there's a sense that John blithely on page 23 says it's okay if she visits with Dan. And we start to get intuitions that they do not have an emotionally satisfying relationship, Dr. Manhattan and Silk Spectre. And in this date, if you will, that Night Owl has with Silk Spectre, it has flirty dialogue. It has her discontent with being what she calls as Dr. Manhattan's kept woman. And there's some obvious flirting with comments about her previous costume and Night Owl's kind of nonchalance and non-judgment about that. And there's also nostalgia. So here, as far as plot devices, we also have, in addition to having death with a murder and a murder mystery, we also have the other classic, love. I want to talk really quickly about the chapter organization of the remaining chapters. In the first one, the comedian is dead. The first one, we find that the character we previously might have had sympathy for because he was a dead superhero was a bad person. Then 3, Dr. Manhattan leaves, which is astronomical because he seemed like he would be center of the superhero group. Then we have flashbacks on Dr. Manhattan. Then Rorschach is captured. And then we get into a flashback that creates pathos for the seemingly impenetrable Rorschach in the Who is Rorschach passage. Then we have the romance that was kind of previewed in chapter 1, and then we have Rorschach release, and that's only the first 8. But you see how Moore sets up these 8 out of the introductions of the first one. Very brilliant plot designing.